joining us this afternoon. See a full house. Quite clearly, the topic of Indo-Pacific is quite interesting. It's an idea, probably one of the new ideas that has gained ground in our region in the last few years. And with the adoption of the term by the Trump administration, it has now got quite a significant salience today in the general foreign policy and the security discourse in the region. So we're going to look at this region of the Indo-Pacific. We have representatives from 4 countries to talk about it. We got Nadia Schadlow from the US National Security Council. We have Christopher Pyne from the Ministry of Defense, Australia. We have Maliki Osman, a Senior Minister of State for Defense and Foreign Affairs, Singapore, and Mr. Madhav from the BJP in India. So we have 4 panelists. So I'm not going to take too much time, and I think they have a lot to say on the subject of the Indo-Pacific, on the changing nature of the great power relations, and on the contestation, the alignment, realignment, de-alignment, a whole lot of things that are happening between the major powers and within the region, the weakening of the old institutions, the creation of the new institutions like the Quad. So you have actually a fairly dynamic space. So to talk about it, we have these 4 people, and I'm going to start with Nadia Schadlow, because after all, it's America first.
Good way to start. Thank you very much. Well, it's a privilege to be here. This is actually my first trip to India, and I'm so happy to be in your extraordinary country. I'm especially honored to be here at Raisina. It's a perfect venue to discuss the Indo-Pacific region, and it might even become one of the preeminent, indispensable annual conferences for the region. In my brief remarks today, I thought I would talk a little bit about the main themes of the United States, the new national security strategy that the Trump administration published in late December. If I had to assess in one way what this strategy is about and what it does, I would say that it essentially assesses in a realistic way what the current geopolitical environment looks like. That's really the first step toward developing good strategy. You have to understand what the political, economic, and military conditions are, and how to orchestrate and create the instruments of power to support a nation's long-term strategic objectives. America's long-term objective is, of course, like most of us in the audience knows, peace and prosperity. But as the historian and strategist Donald Kagan once remarked, a repeated error throughout history has been the failure to understand that the preservation of peace requires active effort. It requires planning and resources and sacrifice. Successful strategy building, therefore, requires strategic clarity, as opposed to leaving certain realities unspoken. We need to clearly articulate the key features of the world today, and I think that that's what this strategy did. While we might have wanted victory in the Cold War to be decisive, the reality is that military, economic, and political trends in the global balance of power have been shifting. The new information environment accelerates these trends. There is no arc of history that ensures that free political and economic models will prevail. Success or failure depends upon all of our actions. The Trump administration's strategy seeks to shift the balance of power back in favor of the United States, its allies, and its partners. The challenges posed by repressive governments and non-state actors are real, especially the threats they pose to free and open societies such as the United States and India. Today, we also confront the reality of states and networked organizations that repress citizens, manipulate information, and restrict access to outside information. These actors are much less likely to play constructive roles in international affairs. As the post-Cold War balance of power has shifted, confidence in the rules-based order also diminished, not because its principles are invalid, but because it was not modernized to reflect new realities. Its rules have not been robustly enforced, as some state seeks to exploit it for its own ends. This administration has a positive vision for America's role in the world. The strategy explains how we will protect the American people and our interests, strengthen the security and well-being of like-minded partners and allies, and defend America's unique position in the world because the stability of the global order depends upon it. Looking at the world around us, a key insight of the strategy is that we live in a competitive environment and we must compete more effectively against those challenging us. The strategy highlights that military, political, and economic trends don't just happen, they're not just random, but they're driven by actors out there, by revisionist powers, rogue powers, and transnational threat actors, such as the jihadist terrorists that are noted in the strategy. Given these competitive environments and these trends, we need to prevail, we need to work with our allies and partners to compete. A second key theme of the strategy is to reinforce confidence in the model that America offers. This restoration of confidence enables us to continue to play a constructive role in the world. The strategy also affirms that we will cooperate with states, but that we also expect cooperation with reciprocity. Alliances and partnerships are stronger when they are anchored in shared responsibility and a fair expenditure of resources. Rules matter, but their incantation is not equivalent to effective implementation. As President Trump stated during his APEC address in November, those who join us in upholding the rules will be our closest economic partners, and those who do not can be certain that the United States will not turn a blind eye to violations or economic aggression. Finally, the strategy recognizes that America has a catalytic role to play in the world. A passive United States that cedes leadership is not going to end up in a secure and prosperous world. If we step back, malign actors will fill the void. This approach has special resonance in the Indo-Pacific. First, the United States will lead in the pursuit of a free and open Indo-Pacific. We will marshal the will and the capabilities to compete and prevent unfavorable shifts in the regional balance of power while respecting the sovereignty and independence of all nations. Second, relatedly, our vision for the Indo-Pacific excludes no nation. We are not drawing lines or forcing choices. We wish to create alternative options for nations seeking security, connectivity, and economic development. American and Indian participation in the East Asia Summit is one example. Quadrilateral dialogues in the region are also other examples. We also need to ensure that existing mechanisms for cooperation are sufficiently flexible to respond to emerging challenges. Third, we must recognize that the character of governments matter, and that the way governments treat their citizens matter. In this region and around the world, we face a competition between free and repressive visions. We will maintain a forward military presence capable of deterring and, if necessary, defeating any adversary. The competitions we are engaged in and the threats to sovereignty and prosperity are moral and ideological, even if they manifest in economic and military terms. A forum like this, which showcases free and open dialogue and uncensored debate, represents an enduring source of strength of like-minded nations and aspiring partners throughout the region. America's new national security strategy recognizes, more so than previous ones, the centrality of the U.S.-India strategic partnership. We underscore the importance of expanding our defense and security cooperation by noting India's unique status as a major defense partner. This partnership is a cornerstone of American foreign policy in the region. Our support for India's rise as a leading global power, as Prime Minister Modi has noted, is centered on the recognition that India is a pillar of our common vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific. My friend, Ambassador Ken Juster, made a wonderful speech here recently in Delhi, I think last week, in which he discussed what it means to be a friend of India. Key to this friendship, as Ken described, are the qualities of respect, trust, acceptance, confidence, and constancy. The national security strategy affirms that India has no shortage of friends in Washington, and we look forward to translating this strategic convergence into continued cooperation into the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Schadlow. I would now turn to Minister Pyne, and we know that Australia, one of the first countries to really to develop and expand the idea of Indo-Pacific. Australia faces both the oceans, so it was quite natural that look at the world beyond the old framework of Asia-Pacific. So we'd like to hear from you how Australia is going to look at Indo-Pacific and how your policies are adapting to the new dynamic.
Thank you very much, Raja. It's a great pleasure to be here at the Raisina Dialogue. Australia really welcomes opportunities like this one to bring together like-minded individuals, countries, institutions to talk about the future of the world in which we live. Australia, of course, is right in the centre of what we would describe as the Indo-Pacific region. As you point out, we face both the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. We have particular interests in the South Pacific, where I think most of the world regards our role there as a very important one. And we have, I think, underdone our relationship looking west towards India in the Indian Ocean, something that we are now correcting in Australia in terms of our military-to-military engagement and government-to-government engagement. I think that's a very important development in recent years. So the Raisina Dialogue does give us in Australia an opportunity to meet with and talk to people who are wanting to achieve the same outcomes, many of which Nadia touched on. What I wanted to talk about in particular, I wanted to talk about the role of great powers in the Indo-Pacific, but I also wanted to talk about our rules-based international order, albeit briefly. I think one of the errors that we might make in those countries that support what has been a maxim of our world since the Second World War, an engagement with an international rules-based order, we have tended to accept the criticisms of that order as though many of them are valid and allow ourselves to try and accommodate, in many respects, what some of those criticisms might be. Sometimes we feel under siege, and we sometimes question whether the criticisms of the rules-based international order are valid. Well, we in Australia have a very clear-eyed view about the rules-based international order. We think it is very much worth defending. And as Nadia pointed out, not just defending rhetorically, but actually reaffirming, strengthening and supporting where required militarily and in other ways throughout the Indo-Pacific region. One of the things that highlights the Indo-Pacific region is the enormous differences between many of the countries that make it up. We have liberal democracies like Australia and India, right through to countries that have either been communist in the past, like Vietnam, and are now embracing much more models around the market, through to countries that still have clearly communist regimes and not the particular attachment to democracy that we might have in Australia. Things like the Raisina Dialogue, I think, give us the opportunity to reaffirm our values and our values-based foreign and defence and economic policies. So today, I think in this session, it would be worth talking about what the benefits of those of the rules-based order has been for the last 70 plus years. Even those countries that are challenging, if you like, our values as nations have benefited from the rules-based order. A country, for example, like China, emerging from the Second World War and the many decades of communist rule that didn't embrace any market principles, has now become a very, very wealthy nation, lifting hundreds of millions of its people out of poverty because of the rules-based international order. Because China has been welcome amongst the Commonwealth of Nations around the world in a model that encourages trade, encourages economic growth, education, wanting to lift all of our people out of poverty into the middle classes, the upper middle classes that many of the countries that are represented here come from. So in spite of some of the criticisms of the way that we in Australia look at the world, in fact, many of the countries that have challenged what we have taken for granted over the last 70 years have been the great beneficiaries economically from that attachment to free markets, to trade, to secure sea lanes and regions like the Indo-Pacific. So we believe strongly in encouraging that prosperity, in bringing other countries, whether they're very small countries like Laos and Cambodia, through to very large countries like India, into a full complement of that kind of approach to economy, foreign policy and defence. In economy, of course, this is particularly relevant to Australia. We're an island nation. We need free, open sea lanes and trade lanes, both west and north, of course, and east, but particularly through places like the South China Sea. So one of the issues that we think is important in Australia is making sure that all the countries in our region respect the rule of law when it comes to free and open travel, whether it's through the South China Sea or through the Malacca Straits or elsewhere. And that's why we take seriously any attempts by any other countries to make claims over areas that we regard as potentially inhibiting that freedom of trade. That isn't a criticism of any particular country. It is a statement of the realities that trading nations like Australia face. And as a consequence, we do take that seriously, and we do press back on all those issues around things like freedom of travel and transport, whether it's air or sea, through our part of the world in the Indo-Pacific. The second thing I'd like to touch on is the issue of great power activity in the Indo-Pacific. The reality is that we have great nations like the United States, China and India that are very substantial economic and military powers in the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific is host to 6 nuclear-powered nations and 2 of the largest standing armies in the world, in India and China. To try and ameliorate, mitigate, downplay that would just simply not be diplomatically or defence realistic. So we welcome great power engagement. To us in Australia, that means having a mutually respectful dialogue. It means the United States being engaged in our region. The policies in the last 10 years where the United States has looked towards Asia are ones that are very welcome in our part of the world. The balance between countries like India and China and the United States are important to us. We don't want any particular nation to be greater or more powerful than others. We want everyone to respect each other's role in our part of the world. And when we've had visits in Australia from the Chinese Premier, they have, of course, reinforced that view. China understands that it's a very large military power and economic power. That can sometimes be misunderstood by countries. So we in Australia want to engage with China and bring China fully into the fora of our part of the world where there aren't misunderstandings in the future. Similarly, India, which of course is a democratic nation and one that we have had a long engagement with here in Australia, is a great military power and a huge economic power with greater potential into the future than so far has been realised, and we want to, I think we all want to help to bring that about. And similarly, we want India to be engaged in our part of in the Indo-Pacific to make sure that that balance is addressed. Mutually respectful, supportive of the international rules-based order, encouraging prosperity and growth and education, because we feel that what has served us well in the last 75 years can serve us well in the next 75 years. We don't believe that we should accommodate those criticisms of that order that would seek to reduce its effectiveness. We actually want to bring countries to the understanding that all of us being prosperous and peaceful is good for all of our peoples in all of our nations. So with those few words, I might leave it at that and then look forward to a dialogue discussion with the crowd.
Thank you, Minister Pyne. Please join me. I now come to Minister Osmani from Singapore. Of course, all of you know that India has a very special, almost exclusive relationship with Singapore. When we talk about the Indo-Pacific, it can be a very abstract concept, but for Singapore, which is right in the middle of the Indo-Pacific, That's where in the Malacca Straits, where the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean meet. And historically, the role of Singapore has been really both as a junction connecting the two oceans, promoting trade, as well as trying to bring the two regions together. As it happens, Singapore today is the chair of the Association of the Southeast Asian Nations, which has long been the platform on which we've tried to promote regional integration, promote regional security. So, floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Mohan. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention. First of all, I'm really very happy to be able to join you today for this third Raisina Dialogue. The topic for this session really is particularly apt in today's evolving regional landscape. So I'll focus my remarks on the role of ASEAN that ASEAN can play in this emerging dynamics. The region between the Indian and Pacific Oceans boasts the world's three largest economies, as we know, US, China, Japan, as well as 7 of the world's 10 fastest growing markets, and is expected to generate more than half of the world economic output in the coming years. We have 2 billion people connected to the global economy and hundreds of millions raised from abject poverty to a rising middle class. Common threats to the regional security are also becoming more pervasive and will require concerted and coordinated transnational efforts to manage. A major concern is the continued tensions in the Korean Peninsula. Our hope is for an early resumption of meaningful dialogue among the main stakeholders, such as the recent Inter-Korea Dialogue. Other threats to regional security have increasingly come from non-state actors in the form of terrorism, violent extremism, and cybercrime. From hardened fighters and extremists that return from Iraq and Syria, to the malicious WannaCry ransomware that infected computers worldwide, many security issues now transcend national boundaries. No single country can solve them alone, and collective effort will be needed to tackle these challenges. We have also seen a wave of populist nationalism developing across the globe. Such sentiments, fueled in part by deep-seated frustration over wage stagnation and the influx of immigrants, have been particularly salient in shaping voting patterns in the West and raising questions about the benefits of free trade. This is a trend that countries in our part of the world may have to also face one day. Amid these strains of nationalist sentiments, a key challenge for governments of today and tomorrow will be to find ways to strengthen collaboration for win-win outcomes. I should also add that strong and stable relations amongst major powers is a prerequisite for a peaceful and prosperous Indo-Pacific region. And the US-China relations is one of the most important bilateral relationships in the world. The relationship is complex and has significant spillover effects on the global community. It is important that both sides recognize the fundamental importance of pursuing mutually beneficial cooperation with each other and ensure that competition does not lead to conflict. Let me just talk a little bit about ASEAN now. At the heart of this landscape, Southeast Asia serves as a gateway between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. This makes Southeast Asia and ASEAN not only crucial in the Indo-Pacific, but also central to the regional architecture. ASEAN member states are acutely aware that we are small countries. Only when we come together as a regional bloc of 10 countries do we have the size and weight to compete and to be heard. As a regional group, we have over the decades served as an important and neutral platform for other powers to engage one another constructively. The ASEAN-led mechanisms provide regional countries with a normative framework for cooperation and confidence building. These platforms allow our officials to meet regularly to exchange ideas, strengthen ties, and build their capacities in many areas such as maritime security, counterterrorism, and preventive diplomacy, just to name a few. These interactions produce a resilient network of regional cooperation mechanisms. They also afford greater maneuvering space for small and big countries alike. The overarching aim is to have a balanced, open, and inclusive regional architecture where every player with a legitimate interest in the region has a seat at the table to talk things through. Singapore has assumed the chairmanship of ASEAN this year. As chair, Singapore will continue to deepen cooperation at ASEAN-led fora and build stronger relations with our external partners centered on the themes of resilience and innovation. We aim to build a collective resilience within ASEAN, including economic, social, and financial resilience, and more importantly, security resilience. With innovation, we will press on with regional economic integration and enhance regional connectivity. So to sum up, it is clear that the region brims with immense potential, provided we navigate the challenges well. The thought that I would like to leave is that our region can only realize its full potential if we encourage constructive engagement and stable relations among major players. One of the key ways is to strengthen ASEAN as a credible and united organization and continue to commit to economic integration towards mutually beneficial cooperation for all. So I will stop here. I'll be happy to elaborate further any points during our Q&A and engagement sessions a while later.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. I now turn to Mr. Madhav, who is the National General Secretary of the BJP and the Director of India Foundation. And for those of you who are not Indians, I mean, you need to know that Mr. Madhav has become the face of the ruling party on international affairs. So he's largely emerged as the key spokesman for the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party on its understanding of the world and its engagement with international affairs. Mr. Madhav.
Thank you, Mr. Raj Mohan. I don't know all that, but I know that I am the only non-governmental person here having permission to make irresponsible statements. It cannot be attributed to any government. Friends, what I propose to do is to highlight in this strategic conversation 6 strategic realizations that we have had in India with the advent of this new century. And in the light of those 6 strategic realizations that we have had, what we expect as strategic realizations that the world should have about this region. And Mr. Rajmohan need not worry, all this in less than 5 minutes. Friends, realization number 1 for India, as everybody before me has talked about, the global power axis in this century has shifted away from the Pacific Atlantic region to Indo-Pacific region. The Indian Ocean has emerged as the new global power hub. Realization number 2 for us. As an important country in this region, it brings us enormous opportunities, but also great challenges. The diminishing power of the Western nations is a reality in this region, and the rising power of countries like China is also a strategic reality here. That brings me to the 3rd realization for India. As a big regional power, in this scenario, we have to reorient our strategic thinking. From a westward thinking nation to an eastward-looking nation is a major shift that was needed in our thinking, in our system. From a land-based approach to an ocean-centric approach is a shift that was needed in our strategic thinking. Realization number 4. Unlike in the Pacific Atlantic region last century when the global power axis existed in that part of the world, in the Indo-Pacific region, you do not just have nations, you have civilizations here. The entire approach to global affairs undergoes a major shift because of the regional geographical reality. The so-called Western way, the so-called American way, is not going to be the way forward in this century and in this region. Realization number 5. Countries like China are bracing ahead, marching ahead with great plans for the region and for the world, the panacea to all the problems that the world faces, from employment to global disunity, plans that can be described as 21st century Marshall plans. India cannot just remain a spectator to it. Now, if you are not a spectator, you can be a participant. India does not want to remain just a mere participant here. India, if it were to become a relevant, important power, it has to be a stakeholder. That is the 5th realization we have had. And the 6th and last realization for us in India was that in this new emerging scenario, India has to give up its strategic reticence, its attitude of aloofness and withdrawing. I am glad to share with you that in the last 3 years under Prime Minister Modi's leadership, we have given up the strategic reticence and we have emerged as an active, ambitious global player. Friends, in the light of these 6 realizations that we have had in this century, beginning of the century, we want the world to have 6 realizations. First, that now that Indian Ocean has emerged as the epicenter of global power, global politics, we have to give us the old 20th century phrases like Asia, Pacific, etc. It has to be Indo-Pacific for all of us to understand the issues here. It's not about that name. I know, we know very well that just as South China Sea doesn't belong to China, Indian Ocean doesn't belong to India alone. But the centrality and primacy of Indian Ocean to global politics needs to be appreciated. That's the realization number 1 that we expect from the world. Number 2, India is keen to play a proactive role in global affairs. It has a stated ambition to rise as an influential and responsible global power. I'm using two words which were used by us in our official statement: influential and responsible global power. World should realize that India's rise will be for the good of the world and for the peace of the world. Realization number 3. In this new emerging power scenario, the old alliances and old institutions of the 20th century are becoming irrelevant and ineffective. The so-called, as I mentioned earlier, so-called American way will not probably guide the affairs in the region. The future of the institutions in the global institutions will be taking shape in the light of the experiences and wisdom of this region. It will be Asia-centric approach hereafter. Realization number 4, that between India and the West, we want India-led approach, framework to the east of our country, India-participated framework to the west of our country. Realization number 5, countries in the Indian Ocean region are eager to have their own code for conducting affairs in the region. imperative on the part of the rest of the world to support such an endeavor, such an effort for a peaceful, non-intrusive growth of the countries in the region. And the last realization that we would expect from the rest of the world in the light of the present scenario in the region is that towards the end of last century, we have had bipolar politics in the last century. Towards the end of the last century, we have had our dreams about end of history and unipolar world, etc. But when the century began, we all talked about multipolarism. In the name of multipolarism, largely we have become cheerleaders of anything and everything that is happening in the world. When I say cheerleaders, I specifically talk about the 21st century Marshall Plan of our neighbor. We cannot just be cheerleaders. We need to move from multipolarism to multi-stakeholderism. Friends, these are the 12 points I would place before you and leave it to your discretion. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've heard 4 very sharp presentations from the 4 countries in the Indo-Pacific. So I want to ask one round of questions before we go to the floor. But I want to focus all my questions on one theme that is underlying all this, and which is also the central aspect of international relations, that is sovereignty. We saw Nadia's presentation actually as a continuous references to sovereignty, as well as the Trump doctrine talks about sovereignty. So let's see what this means at this point amidst the issues that we've taken up. So my first question is to Nadia, that the president's speech, whether it's inaugural speech, his speech at the UN, is now the national security strategy, all talk about the importance of national sovereignty. Now, this is not something most of us in India expect. Actually, we think Americans want to undermine everyone's sovereignty. We are the ones who talk about sovereignty. The Americans say, no, there is a globalized, transcendental structure that has emerged. But from what we've heard from the administration in the last 1 year, this is a very different approach, and which is kind of generates a bit of cognitive dissonance here. But could you explain why this emphasis on sovereignty? Why this is a better approach than the globalist song of the last many decades?
Sure. Essentially, the president was elected. He wanted to strengthen. Sovereignty means several things. First, just simply strengthening our borders, right? Protecting the United States from transnational criminal organizations, terrorists, strengthening our borders. So that element of sovereignty. Second, the belief that ultimately democracy and sovereignty are inextricably intertwined, essentially, that sovereign states are the best protectors of democracy. So essentially going back to America's founding documents. And third, a sense that because international institutions need to be modernized, what post-World War II institution in some ways does not, right? Most everything since the post-war period, especially that period, has been and is being modernized. So it was a sense to relook at these institutions, to see to what degree are they still protecting American interests, how can we work through them, but more effectively to get better outcomes for our own interests and our values, but also those of our allies and partners as well. So I think those 3 elements. It was never designed as a concept to be about America alone. It was just designed as a concept to remind people of the importance of our borders and the importance of the relationship between democracy and the nation state. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. I don't think that point has been very well understood in India, that traditionally we frame the issues between India and the US in terms of sovereignty, and that our whole strategy is to protect sovereignty, while it's great to hear about the US talking about sovereignty, about equality, about cooperation on mutually beneficial terms in which there is greater clarity about objectives and the goals to which we work. But I had a follow-up question. I think one is to think about it in abstract terms. But specifically, how does the US hope to secure the sovereignty of a country like Afghanistan, which is undermined by many of the challenges that you pointed out? And the administration has said interesting things about the region, about Afghanistan. And the National Security Council has been quite at the center of the new approach to Afghanistan. So could you tell us a little bit about how the White House is looking at Afghanistan, how we secure the sovereignty of Afghanistan?
Right. Well, I think the fundamental shift with the administration's new South Asia policy has been essentially to recognize that the problem set is a broader part of the broader region, essentially, and you need to rethink relationships in the region and relationships among states in the region, and that's one of the key aspects of the new South Asia strategy. Second, to reaffirm U.S. cooperation, working with the Afghan government and closely with the Afghan government to help set the conditions for a stable Afghanistan. So I think it was a more realistic assessment of what's been happening in Afghanistan over the past few years. So essentially, it's the Afghan state itself and the Afghan government will be responsible for its own sovereignty, but the United States will continue to partner with the Afghan government, as it has for many years, but in strengthening our relationship with the leadership there, as well as continue to reaffirm our commitment to Afghanistan. Another feature of the strategy was the sustainable nature of the strategy, to basically make it a sustainable strategy, to know that we are in there for the long term.
Thank you. And are you hopeful, 6 months after the South Asia strategy, are you hopeful that the objectives set can actually be realized in the...
I'm hopeful. I am hopeful. There are many people in this audience who are much more expert than me on Afghanistan, but I'm hopeful, yes.
Thank you. I want to come to you. I mean, I'm quite fascinated by the debate in Australia, and again, has something to do with sovereignty. We used to think that the intervention in the internal affairs used to be largely done by the Western countries. But I believe your country is having a very interesting debate on Chinese interference in your internal affairs. I mean, it's again, I think it's of great interest in India. I mean, so could you tell us, I mean, what is the problem? How have you diagnosed it, and what is your government doing about securing, shall we say, Australian sovereignty in the new context?
Well, it's a loaded question, potentially a very...
It was meant to be.
A very dangerous one. My media advisors are starting to get quite nervous about how I might answer this question. Well, there's a couple of things. I mean, I was interested in what Ram had to say about what I saw as a very binary choice between the Indo-Pacific being the centre of power versus the Atlantic and the Pacific. And your questions about sovereignty and foreign interference, they're all interlinked. I don't see sovereignty as a binary choice. I think that's an old-fashioned way of looking at how countries will develop and interact now and into the future. In Australia, we prefer to see these things through a prism of values. Whether a country is a liberal democracy or whether it is coming out of the Cold War period where government might have had a greater say and the people less say, if the countries demonstrate a values-based approach, then surely they will want to have as free a country as possible, free press, free association, a free trade, greater prosperity for their people, education and health services spread evenly and equality across the system. So it doesn't become an issue of sovereignty and states being threatened by each other. It becomes, how do we interact together? Now, obviously, there are rogue states like North Korea, but if you take out those, like golf handicapping, if you take out those rogue states, then almost all the countries in the Indo-Pacific want similar outcomes. Obviously, we have to deal with Islamic extremism that reaches the point of terrorism. These are things that we have to deal with. But generally, we would want in the Indo-Pacific an approach where a values-based attitude replaces these binary choices that I thought that Ram was talking about. In terms of foreign interference, well, cyber security is a fact of life these days. As Defence Industry Minister, I talk now about our four services, the Air Force, the Navy, the Air Force, the Navy, the Army, and our cyber security agencies, because they are a critical part of the defence of a nation. we've seen, not just in Australia, but all around the world, a huge uptick in cyber crime and state-sponsored cyber crime designed to have industrial purposes and military purposes. So, but Australia isn't an orphan in this regard. All countries face similar problems, and there'll be a great deal more resources being spent on cyber defence into the future than we've seen in the past. We've just introduced new legislation in Australia to do with foreign interference. That isn't directed at any particular power. That is just the normal insurance policies that governments should take to defend their interests and their people. And whatever countries or companies, or for that matter, might be responsible for trying to breach the security of a nation should face the consequences. We live in a region where there is a great deal of cyber security activity, and India faces the same challenges. Much of it is not directed at defence installations. Much of it is directed at industrial espionage for the purposes of being able to gain the intellectual property that would otherwise cost those countries or companies the resources that they need to be able to gain the advantages that other countries or companies have had.
I mean, if I might just probe a little, I mean, I'm not calling it a contradiction, but maybe an antinomy. I mean, you talked about...
Contradiction's good.
Yeah, you talked about political values, the importance of liberal democracies, and you also talked about the cybersecurity threat. I mean, one of the things we've learned in the last few years, and there's a big debate in the United States and other places, that democracies are far more vulnerable to interference through today with the cyber technologies, the new digital media, the capacities that have been created. And does that concern your country? I mean, I think what we're hearing, what is going on in Europe or the United States, I mean, does it bother you that your political process can be manipulated by external forces?
Well, there's no doubt that the sunny attitude that countries like Australia had to freedom of expression and speech and activities in the internet has been in retreat. In the last 10 years, because of international terrorism and cyber crime, many of the freedoms that we used to take for granted in Australia have certainly been limited to protect our people and our interests. There's no reason, though, inherently why a liberal democracy should be weaker than another form of government. If a government has a clear-sighted view of its security responsibilities and the resources to defend its nation, then a democracy is just as able to be secured as a non-democracy. And in fact, history tells us that democracies have been very successful at defending themselves in the last 100 years. But there's no doubt that the attitude we might have taken 10, 15 years ago is quite different now. And it's not just government that's aware of that, but the Australian people are well aware of that. So if we might have faced criticisms in the past from the liberal end of the political spectrum for curtailing some of those freedoms, that is a very muted criticism these days. Because terrorist attacks have been interdicted by Australian agencies, the Australian public, I think, accept that now as a reality.
Thanks. I mean, I want to turn to Singapore. I mean, sovereignty versus intervention in a national context, I mean, I think can also be extended to ASEAN.
Yes.
We all love ASEAN centrality. Delhi is preparing to receive all the 10 ASEAN leaders in the next few days. But the debate in ASEAN that the ASEAN centrality is being undermined by the power shift that has taken place, and the perception of American weakness, the fears about China's rise. They've raised questions about, can the ASEAN as a collective handle this? I mean, that's one part. Second, we've also heard how ASEAN's coherence is being undermined by the power shift. So given these considerations, do you see, I mean, I think ASEAN being able to hold on to its central position, or are we in the danger of going back to a period of the future is like the past, where Southeast Asia could once again become the Balkans of Asia?
Well, I think if you look at ASEAN as a bloc, we start off with the position that sovereignty is not antithesis to national interests.
On regional integration.
And regional integration. And that's how we started out in the first place. And the centrality of ASEAN being one of the cornerstone of principles of ASEAN is in itself and has in itself worked very well for ASEAN. ASEAN centrality also rides on another principle of non-interference in the domestic affairs of countries, and that allows us to continue to maintain the issue of sovereignty. And the way ASEAN has worked is we recognize the fact that we are just small countries in the region, which is important and critical, and for us to engage not just one or two big countries, but many, through various ASEAN-led platforms. So you talk about the ARF, you talk about ADMM, ADMM Plus, you're talking about the East Asian Summit. These are all ways in which ASEAN presents itself as a place where different people, different stakeholders can come and continue to engage and come to the table and discuss and talk about the significance of and value of international relations and how we can ride on each other. In that context, there will always be differences of opinions and ideas, but that platform itself allows us to see ASEAN as critical in bringing together different people. And the ASEAN-led forums have been able to do that.
Can I ask one follow-up question? I mean, I think, again, related to sovereignty. When Philippines went to the international arbitration on the South China Sea dispute, the court ruled that on every count, that the Chinese had no case. Now, after that, has that made any difference to the situation on the ground, or the changed facts, new facts that have been created on the ground? Are they going to be with us? So therefore, this idea of whether it's a liberal international order, its capacity to enforce rules, its capacity to protect the sovereignty of the weak, I'm not saying, who is right, Philippines or China, I'm not getting into that, but I'm just saying, this is the fact. What does ASEAN read into this? I mean, is it, where does this leave us?
Well, I think that's essentially what and how ASEAN has always been operating. It allows every country to manage its own domestic issues with regards to its relationship with other countries, for example. So Philippines is just one of the 4 claimant states as far as the South China Sea issue is concerned, and each claimant state has a different perspective as to what they are
There was a court case here.
Yeah. So we leave it to each country to determine. From ASEAN's perspective, and from Singapore's perspective, is rules-based world order. We want to ensure there's freedom of navigation in the maritime and overflight, and we want to make sure this continues to be upheld. But how each country manages its relationship with, in this case, China, is dependent on the respective countries, and we don't interfere in those aspects of individual relations between two countries.
So I might now turn to Mr. Madhav. I mean, I think you presented this 6 Indian realizations and 6 Indian expectations. It's almost Chinese-like. Chinese are very good at 5 principles and 5 policies, 1 center, 2 points. I mean, they bring a kind of clarity. The Chinese make it easier for the Chinese people as well as the international public to understand what China is doing. I think it's a good system. I'm glad this could be part of our civilizational ethos as well. But
not at the expense of sovereignty.
So I wanted to ask you, one of the interesting things I think in your presentation has been that you didn't mention 2 words which normally we hear about Indian foreign policy. One is non-alignment, one is strategic autonomy. Now, your government, the way you put it, the issues, has talked about India becoming a leading power. You talked about India becoming a responsible power. But my question is, have we fully overcome the residual legacy where in the past we've used slogans like non-alignment or strategic autonomy to avoid taking international positions, to avoid taking responsibility? Is that changing? Is that change enduring in India's approach to the world? Because I think we have many participants from the rest of the world. They would want to know, where is India headed? And I think your presentation really opened up an important window to think about it.
Foreign policy is at one level, it's a continuum. But at another level, we did bring in certain very subtle but very important shifts in our policy. Strategic autonomy has been an article of faith with our government, successive governments. I don't claim it's only our government, but successively have always maintained this position that strategic autonomy, we are wedded to it. We want to maintain that autonomy. But going beyond that, we have introduced for the first time what has popularly become known as de-hyphenation. We have been victims of hyphenated foreign policy. If we have to meet so-and-so leader, we also have to keep in mind the sentiment of the so-and-so other country. This hyphenation in foreign relations, we have faced it, we have practiced it. Our government has put an end to it. Today, we deal with countries on bilateral basis. The whole de-hyphenation that we have put in place in the last 3 years has helped us in forging strong bilateral ties to the interest of both the countries concerned, while not excluding any country. So this is a major shift that we have brought in. On the regional question also, no, I deliberately mentioned in my, those, you call them Chinese points, I say it is an Asian perspective.
Yeah.
That is probably, that is going to be the way forward. You know, democracy, about which you have raised 2-3 important questions, not as a model. The moment you make it into a model, it's like one religion for the whole world, which will never succeed. Democracy as a value. If capitalism can have Chinese characteristic, why not democracy have Asian characteristic? So we have to, we in India are attempting to give them an Asian flavor. Look at it from the Asian reality. That's why I said this century belongs to this Indian Ocean region, this geographical region.
But the central point you made was about Indian leadership, India taking more responsibilities. You see that as something that will endure in the way India is evolving in the world?
3 years ago, when our Prime Minister visited USA, in the joint statement for the first time, this phrase, India's ambition to rise as an influential and responsible global power, was used. We believe in that. As I said, we have the ambition to rise as an influential global power. We believe that we have all the required qualities to be a responsible global power. We are pursuing that agenda, but as I said, India's rise will be for the good of the world and for the peace of the world.
Thank you, Mr. Madhav, and I think we have to bring this to a close. We've taken a few minutes, we started a few minutes late, so Samir will excuse us for taking those few minutes extra. But let me just conclude by saying what we've heard today. I think the title of the session was Indo-Pacific, which is a new geographic construct. We've talked about the possibilities that the new US strategy might generate. We looked at the countries of the region, looking at the changing geography, and in our discussion after the initial presentations, even simple notions like sovereignty, the way we framed them in the last 40 years, and where the countries relate to them are going to fundamentally change. Therefore, I think the prospect of significant structural change unfolding in our region is the essential element. And I think we should be open, we should be flexible in imagining what we ought to do and how we ought to do our responses to a transforming world. That, I think, to quote the head of the Raisina Dialogue, a disruptive transition that is in place. And I think the challenge for us is, can we intellectually cope with it? And whether countries like ours, all of us are democracies, and can we cooperate in dealing with the disruptive challenges that are emerging before us? So, Samir, back to you.
So please join me in applauding the panel and Dr. Raja Mohan for moderating it.